The Cook. A historical fiction of love, identity and fate by S.J. Chapter 13. No Going Back. The stark contrast between first-class grandeur and the wild, unrestrained energy of the crew's hidden world was almost dizzying. Just hours ago, Lydia Weatherby had been draped in pearls, her sapphire evening gown clinging to her form in perfect refinement as she sat beneath the golden glow of chandeliers in the first-class dining salon. She had smiled, nodded, engaged in polite, careful conversation with distinguished gentlemen who saw her as a name, a fortune, a future wife to be secured. But down here, below the Titanic's gilded decks, she felt weightless. No titles, no expectations, just the thrill of being someone else for a night. The low-ceilinged room pulsed with heat, packed with off-duty sailors, maids, firemen and cooks. The air smelled of salt, sweat, whiskey and burning oil, a far cry from the delicate perfumes of first class. The makeshift dance floor was crowded, boots pounding against wooden planks, skirts whirling in chaotic joy. A fiddler and an accordion player filled the air with raucous, untamed Irish melodies, setting the pace for a wild, foot-stomping jig. Laughter rang out, unpolished and unrestrained, as the crew drank from shared bottles, the bitter bite of whiskey warming their throats. Candlelight flickered against the riveted metal walls, casting shadows that swayed with the movement of the ship. Lydia stood at the edge of the scene, breathless, her dark curls falling loose around her shoulders, her corset unlaced just enough to let her breathe. She was no longer Miss Weatherby, the debutante, the heiress, the meticulously trained woman meant for a future she did not want. She was just a girl, laughing, spinning, utterly free. The first time Gideon Christopher took her hand, Lydia barely had a second to react before he pulled her into the dance. Gideon didn't dance like the rigid, measured suitors of her world, their movements practiced and predictable. No, he danced like he lived. Confident, unapologetic, wild. His rough, calloused hands guided her without hesitation, his grip firm and steady, as though he had never doubted for a second that she could keep up.
Careful, Miss Weatherby,
he teased, his voice low and rich, his breath warm against her cheek.
Wouldn't want you tripping in those fancy shoes.
Lydia's lips curved into a defiant smirk as she twirled beneath his arm, her skirt flaring out, her breath catching in her throat from exhilaration rather than exhaustion.
I don't trip.
She shot back, arching a brow.
And you dance like a man who's had too much whiskey.
Gideon's laughter rumbled in his chest, flashing her a mischievous grin as he pulled her closer, closer still, until their bodies were barely a breath apart.
Then I suppose we're evenly matched,
he murmured, and somehow, somewhere in the whirlwind of the music and the heat and the press of bodies, she forgot the way she was supposed to behave, forgot the rules, forgot the name Weatherby meant anything at all. Because Gideon wasn't looking at her like she was an heiress, a prize to be won, or a future bride. He was looking at her like he simply wanted her. The song slowed. A new melody filled the air, softer, unhurried, dangerously intimate. His hands slid lower, resting at her waist, his grip steady, unapologetic. Lydia exhaled slowly, tilting her head just slightly.
You never asked why I came back.
Gideon smirked.
I didn't have to.
Her dark eyes flickered with curiosity, narrowing slightly.
And why's that?
He leaned in, his voice a whisper of heat against her ear.
Because, Miss Weatherby,
he murmured.
I think you want to forget who you are.
A shiver ran down her spine, because he was right. The party around them pulsed with movement, crew members laughing, boots stomping against the floorboards, the warm glow of lanterns flickering against the low ceiling. But in the lively, crowded crew quarters, Lydia and Gideon sat across from each other, their conversation flowing easily over the laughter, the music, and the clatter of tankards against wooden tables. Their words were light-hearted, tossed back and forth with teasing smiles, lost occasionally in the din, but always found again in a glance or a grin. Gideon leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the bench, the bottle of ale in his hand, forgotten.
You know,
He said with an easy grin.
my brother works for your family.
Lydia raised a brow, surprised.
He does?
Sebastian Christopher, footman, driver, hardest working lad you'll ever meet.
Gideon said with no small amount of pride.
Got himself the job about 5 years ago, thanks to his girl Evelyn. She's one of the maids at Weatherby House.
Lydia's lips curled into a small smile.
Oh, I don't know him, I'm afraid. I left for school long before then.
She tilted her head thoughtfully.
But if he's anything like you, I imagine he's quite the troublemaker.
Gideon let out a low chuckle.
Nah, Sebastian's the good one. Always has been. I'm the reckless one.
He glanced at her playfully.
Figured you might appreciate that.
Lydia laughed softly, shaking her head.
Well, I'll be sure to keep an eye out for him when I return home.
The words left her mouth before she realized what she had said. She paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the rim of her glass. Gideon caught the shift in her expression. His dark eyes studied her for a moment before he spoke again.
And your home? That's in Long Island, aye?
Lydia nodded.
Yes, Weatherby House, it's...
She hesitated, then sighed.
I suppose I won't be there for long, though.
He tilted his head.
Why's that?
Lydia exhaled, swirling the liquid in her glass.
I'm to be married.
Gideon didn't react immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze unreadable.
Is it true you're marrying a man you've never met, then?
His voice was casual, but there was something beneath it. Something knowing. Something almost amused. Lydia exhaled through her nose, shaking her head.
Not quite. We've been introduced through letters. I have a photograph,
She said softly.
but we don't know each other. Not very well.
She picked at the edge of her sleeve, her voice light, but there was a weight beneath it.
Our parents,
She shrugged and shook her head.
my dowry, his title, you know, it's all very practical.
Gideon let out a quiet chuckle, arching a brow.
Ah, a good solid business arrangement. Sounds romantic.
Lydia shot him a look, but there was no real annoyance in it. If anything, there was something wry in her expression, something unguarded.
I suppose that depends on how you define romantic.
He tilted his head slightly, watching her.
And what do you think of him?
She opened her mouth as if to answer, but then paused. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face, and instead she gave him a small, knowing smile.
That,
She murmured.
is not a conversation I should be having with a man who is not my intended.
Gideon smirked slightly at that, but didn't push. He only nodded once, as if to say fair enough, and took a sip of his ale. A comfortable silence stretched between them before Lydia shifted, her smile returning.
Do you know what I'm looking forward to most when I get back?
He raised a brow.
Do tell.
Her face lit up as she leaned forward, resting her chin in her hand.
Winston.
Gideon chuckled.
A friend of yours?
Lydia grinned.
My spaniel. He's been mine since he was a puppy. He's probably sulking without me, pretending he doesn't care, but the moment I walk through the door, he'll come running.
Gideon shook his head, smiling.
Dogs don't forget the ones who love them.
Lydia sighed wistfully.
I hope you're right.
Gideon studied her for a moment before taking a sip of ale.
Me ma would like you.
He mused. Lydia blinked, a bit caught off guard.
Your mother?
Gideon nodded.
Aye. Best woman I've ever known. Strong. Loyal. Followed me da to America without a second thought. Left everything behind for him. They run the restaurant together, Christopher's Landing.
Lydia smiled.
And that's where you learned to cook, right?
Aye,
he said, rubbing the back of his neck.
didn't appreciate it as much back then. Ran off to find me own way.
He exhaled, shaking his head.
But Ma, she held the family together. She loved me to something fierce. Never doubted him, never questioned their future. Just followed him because she believed in him.
Lydia tilted her head slightly, watching him.
That's beautiful.
Gideon gave a small, thoughtful nod.
Aye, it is.
Another silence passed between them, this one softer, filled with something unspoken. And then, Lydia smirked.
If your mother is as lovely as you say, then I suppose I'd best behave myself.
Gideon chuckled, shaking his head.
Oh, you're in trouble already, little bird.
She raised an eyebrow at the nickname.
Little bird?
He gave her a slow, teasing grin.
Aye, a beautiful little bird, fluttering about where she doesn't belong.
Lydia laughed softly, shaking her head.
Well, I've certainly been called worse.
Gideon leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now.
I imagine you have.
Lydia held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. She swirled her drink idly, eyes twinkling with curiosity.
Christopher's Landing.
She mused.
Your surname? Christopher, it doesn't sound very Irish.
Gideon let out a quiet chuckle, leaning back against the bench.
That's because it's not. Not really. Our family name was Macreostwa back in Ireland.
Lydia raised a brow, intrigued.
Mac Criostwa?
She tested the name on her tongue, tilting her head thoughtfully.
Aye,
He nodded.
but me dad changed it when they got to New York. He wanted something easier to say for Americans. So, Christopher, it became.
He shrugged.
Simpler that way.
Lydia considered this, a small smile playing on her lips.
Gideon Mac Criostwa.
She repeated softly.
It suits you better.
Gideon huffed a quiet laugh.
I doubt anyone else in New York would agree with you.
She smirked.
Well, then they'd be wrong.
Gideon studied her for a long moment, something unspoken flickering behind his dark eyes. Then, with an easy grin, he lifted his bottle, tipping it toward her.
To all the wrong opinions in New York, then.
Lydia laughed, clinking her glass lightly against his. The music swelled again, the warmth of the moment settling between them like an unspoken promise. Tonight, they were simply Lydia and Gideon, a girl and a boy, a lady and a cook, a life that could have been, if only the world were different. And when Gideon took Lydia's hand, leading her toward the quieter, dimly lit hallway beyond the party, Kate knew she should step in, should remind Lydia of who she was, of the future waiting for her. But she didn't. She told herself it wasn't her place, that Lydia wasn't a child in need of minding, that this wasn't her decision to make. And yet deep down, Kate knew the truth. She didn't stop them because she wanted Lydia to have this, to have a moment that belonged only to her, untouched by expectation or duty. In truth, she wanted Lydia, the caged bird, to be free. The hallway was narrow, lit only by the faint glow of flickering electric lamps, the distant hum of the Titanic's engines vibrating beneath their feet. Lydia stood still, the air between them thick, heavy. Gideon still held her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, the gesture intimate, effortless, as if he had done it 100 times before.
I should go.
Lydia murmured, but she didn't move. Gideon's lips quirked, tilting his head slightly.
You don't sound very sure of that.
Her breath caught.
I...
But before she could finish, he kissed her. Lydia froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath caught between shock and something else, something dangerous, something exhilarating. She wasn't used to this. She had been courted, had been promised to a man she barely knew. But she had never been kissed. Not like this. Not at all. Her first instinct was to pull back, her eyes wide, breath uneven. Gideon immediately stilled, his expression shifting, as though he feared he had crossed a line.
Lydia,
But then She did something neither of them expected. She grabbed his face, fingers threading into his dark hair, and pulled him back in. This time, she kissed him. Deeply, desperately, as if she had just realized that this was what she had been waiting for her entire life. And Gideon? He gladly kissed her back. When they finally broke apart, the air between them was thick, charged, as if the world had shifted, tilted just slightly off its axis. Lydia exhaled sharply, her breath coming in uneven, shallow pulls. Gideon's hands still rested against her waist, steadying her, or perhaps himself. His gaze was soft, but there was something else there too, something deeper, something weighty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gideon's thumb brushed absently over the curve of her hip, his voice lower now, quieter.
Stay with me.
He murmured. Lydia blinked, still dazed from the kiss.
What?
When we get to New York,
His eyes searched hers.
stay with me.
Her stomach flipped, a sudden rush of warmth flooding her chest. He was serious. Lydia let out a breathless laugh, trying to ground herself.
Gideon,
I mean it.
He stepped closer, his voice steady, certain, sure in a way she had never felt about anything in her entire life.
Don't go back to that world, not if you don't want to.
Her breath hitched. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that she couldn't just leave. But could she? For the first time in her life, she had begun to ask herself what she wanted. Not what was expected, not what was proper, not what would secure the future her family had laid out for her, but what she wanted. And the terrifying thing was, she didn't know the answer yet. Lydia swallowed, forcing a small smile.
you're drunk, Gideon.
Not enough to say something I don't mean.
His voice was quiet but strong, unwavering. Her heart twisted.
You don't understand.
Then tell me.
She hesitated, then exhaled slowly.
My life has already been decided for me.
Gideon scoffed softly, shaking his head.
That's not an answer, that's an excuse.
Her jaw tightened.
It's my reality.
He studied her for a moment, then tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable.
And is that what you want?
Lydia's lips parted, but no words came. Did she? She had spent so long being who she was supposed to be that she wasn't even sure she knew how to be anything else. But for the first time, on this ship, in these stolen nights with Gideon, she had felt alive. She had felt free. And the thought of losing that, of stepping off the Titanic and back into the life that waited for her. It felt like drowning. Gideon saw something shift in her gaze because his next words were gentler, softer, edged with something achingly real.
Stay with me.
He whispered. Her throat tightened.
You don't even know me.
I know enough.
His fingers curled slightly at her waist like he was afraid to let go.
I know you laugh with your whole body when you're not trying to be proper.
Her heart clenched.
I know you dance like you don't care who's watching.
He continued, his voice warm and steady.
And you hold your breath before you speak sometimes, like you're waiting for permission to say what you really mean.
Lydia swallowed hard. Gideon's dark eyes burned into hers.
And I know you don't want to go back to that world.
Silence stretched between them. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat had closed, her pulse hammering so loud she could barely think. Gideon searched her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed, giving her waist a final, lingering squeeze before stepping back.
I'm not asking for an answer now.
He said quietly. Lydia released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding.
But if this is just a dream for you, if you already know how this ends,
He continued, voice steady but laced with something vulnerable.
just say the word and I'll leave you be.
Her chest tightened. She didn't want to hurt him. She didn't want to lie to him, but most of all, she didn't want to lie to herself. Lydia took a step back, her fingers still tingling from where they had clutched onto him.
I should go.
she whispered. Gideon nodded once, jaw tight.
Yeah, I know.
But as she took a breath and tried to steady herself, he called after her.
Lady Weatherby,
She stopped, glancing over her shoulder. His gaze was steady.
if you want something else for your life,
He said, voice low, carefully measured.
you don't have to ask permission to take it.
A shiver ran through her, because she knew, deep down in the place she wasn't ready to face yet, he was right. She left before she could change her mind. When Lydia finally re-emerged, her lips still tingling, Kate was waiting for her at the edge of the hallway. Arms crossed, smirking. Lydia stopped short, eyes narrowing.
Don't say a word.
Kate arched an eyebrow.
Didn't plan to.
Lydia huffed, pushing past her. Kate fell into step beside her, leading her back toward the first-class corridors, where Lydia would return to the life she was meant to live. But something had shifted.
You're flushed.
Kate noted, glancing at her with mock innocence.
Had a bit too much whiskey?
Lydia closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose.
I hate you.
Kate grinned.
No, you don't.
Silence. Then,
So,
Kate said lightly, her voice filled with amusement.
how was your first kiss?
Lydia's cheeks burned red. Kate laughed softly, shaking her head. Tomorrow everything would return to normal. But Lydia had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. By the time Kate and Lydia stumbled back into the first-class suite, it was well past midnight. The air in the grand corridors had long since grown still, the ship's more refined guests having retreated to their lavish cabins, leaving only the soft hum of the ocean beyond the portholes and the distant murmur of stewards finishing their nightly duties. Inside the suite, golden lamplight flickered against the mahogany-panelled walls, illuminating the rich brocade drapes and the hand-carved furnishings that seemed almost too elegant for such a moment of disorder. Lydia all but collapsed onto the plush velvet chaise lounge, her dark curls tumbling wildly around her flushed face, her sapphire evening gown slightly askew from the night's excitement. The glittering beads along the bodice caught the light as she stretched, her white silk gloves discarded haphazardly onto the floor beside her matching satin shoes. Her laugh was soft, breathless, as she turned to Kate, her eyes shining, slightly unfocused from too much whiskey and too much dancing.
I don't want to go back into that world, Kate.
Lydia's voice was hushed and slightly slurred, but there was something raw beneath it, something terrifyingly honest.
I don't want to marry a stranger and live a life I have no say in.
Kate, who had been undoing the pearl buttons at her wrist, paused mid-motion, a faint frown creasing her brow.
Lydia.
But Lydia ignored the warning in her voice and instead reached forward, grasping Kate's hands tightly, her grip urgent, almost desperate.
Wait,
Lydia whispered, sitting up suddenly, eyes a little too bright.
I have the perfect idea. What if we switched places when we got to America?
Kate stilled, her breath caught, her heart lurching at the sheer absurdity of the words.
What?
She let out a stunned chuckle, shaking her head as if trying to clear away the ridiculous notion.
You need sleep.
Lydia only nodded fervently, her expression earnest, almost childlike in its sincerity.
Think of it, Kate.
Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, her fingers tightening over Kate's.
A life of luxury, a handsome husband, if you choose to accept him. If not, you can simply say no and be your own woman.
Kate laughed softly, rubbing her forehead.
I told you. I've never even thought of marrying a stranger before.
Lydia's lips curled into a lazy, knowing smile, her lashes fluttering as she rested her head against the chaise's velvet cushions.
Then you don't have to,
she murmured.
Just tell them you won't. When we get to New York, you go to Weatherby House and I'll go with Gideon. You only need to stay a night or two. That's enough time for us to disappear forever.
She laughed drunkenly.
Besides, what do you have to lose?
Kate opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. Because what did she have to lose? Nothing. She wasn't switching places with Lydia forever. She wasn't running off into some uncertain future across the ocean, leaving everything behind. She was just playing the role for a few nights. That was it. 1 or 2 nights at Weatherby House, long enough for Lydia and Gideon to disappear before the prying eyes of society caught on. Long enough to make it seem like nothing was amiss. And then, she could slip away, fade into the background like she always had. No one would be looking for a maid in a borrowed dress. Not once the Weatherby family realized their daughter had vanished with a man below her station. By the time the city woke up to the scandal, she'd be long gone. Free to find her own way, free to walk into any bakery in New York, ask for work, and carve out a life that was finally hers to control. The thought wrapped around her, pulling her under like a wave she wasn't sure she wanted to fight. She swallowed hard, her mind racing between logic and madness, fear and temptation. The idea was impossible, and yet it was intoxicating. With a sigh, Kate bent down, picking up Lydia's gloves and placing them on the armrest of the settee, gathering her shoes and placing them inside the wardrobe. With careful hands, she reached for the delicate pearl buttons at the back of Lydia's gown, loosening them just enough to allow her to breathe more easily. Lydia stirred, mumbling something incoherent, but she didn't protest as Kate unfastened the stiff corset laces beneath the layers of silk. She hesitated only a moment before tugging the loosened bodice down over Lydia's shoulders, leaving her in the soft, embroidered chemise beneath.
That's better,
Kate murmured under her breath. With slow, steady movements, she helped Lydia to her feet, guiding her across the room, the rich fabric of her gown slipping in folds around her as they moved. Easing her onto the silk-covered mattress, Kate pulled back the embroidered duvet, tucking it lightly around her friend's frame. Lydia sighed contentedly, shifting against the pillows, her breath evening out, lost to the haze of sleep before Kate had even stepped away. For a long moment, Kate just stood there, watching the rise and fall of her friend's breathing, watching the way the lamplight flickered over her delicate features, still touched with the remnants of laughter and reckless hope. And in that moment, fate had begun to weave its threads neither of them would be able to undo. She turned off the lamp, plunging the room into a hush of shadows and slow breaths. Then, as Kate slipped quietly into the corridor and closed the door behind her, she couldn't tell if it had all been a dream or the beginning of something real. Next time, in The Cook. 2 letters, one destined for duty, the other for defiance. A secret that could change everything. Some decisions aren't made in grand halls, they're made in hushed moments behind closed doors. 2 letters, one secret, and no turning back. Chapter 14, The Secret Letters, coming soon.